He was an idealistic doctor, hungry for fame, who would champion one of the century's most infamous medical procedures.
He wanted to solve the problems of psychiatry, and he wanted to do it fast.
The lesson here is not how a man can go off the rails, but is how science can go off the rails.
Ellen Ionesco was the first patient to undergo a procedure Dr. Freeman had perfected only weeks before. He called it transorbital lobotomy.
In a transorbital lobotomy, Freeman would first have the patient rendered unconscious through the use of the electroconvulsive shock machine.
Just before he threw the switch, we all had a laying on of hands and we went for a little ride.
Usually 3 successive convulsions are necessary, but in old people a single one may be sufficient, while in a sturdy young person 4 or even 6 convulsions may be administered without danger.
The patient would then enter unconsciousness for a relatively brief period, but several minutes.
Now that the convulsion has subsided, the nurse holds a towel over the nose and mouth of the patient.
Freeman would peel back each eyelid, insert his ice pick, and with a hammer, tap through the brain, wiggle it about, sever the frontal lobes, withdraw it. And when the patient came to, he or she would be given dark glasses to hide the black eyes they'd been given.
We didn't have a refrigerator, we had an ice box. The first ice picks came right out of our kitchen drawer, and they worked like a charm.
Turning now to the operation itself, very little preparation is necessary for transorbital lobotomy.
The instrument was put in above the eyeball and in the plane of the nose. You could feel it hit the roof of the orbit, and then with a tap of a hammer you could knock it through. The whole thing would take 3 or 4 minutes.
This patient came to the hospital this morning after breakfast, and he will leave tomorrow afternoon.
There are reports which he proudly writes down in his diary about fellow professionals fainting as he proceeds in this, or vomiting.
Dr. Watts didn't say anything. He simply turned around and walked out.
Spurred on by Freeman, the number of lobotomies performed annually soared from 150 in 1945 to over 5,000 in 1949. Despite the known side effects, there seemed to be an endless supply of willing patients. Ultimately, the fate of lobotomy would be settled by a pill. In 1954, a new drug called Thorazine began to sweep through state mental hospitals.
Thorazine was initially marketed as a chemical lobotomy. I mean, this was seen as a selling point, that it produced results similar to lobotomy, but without, of course, all the risks of the surgery.
Freeman decided to move to Los Altos, California, to resurrect his career. Far from the reproachful Eastern medical establishment, he could try to bring lobotomy to new categories of patients.
If housewives found their early 1950s existence too depressing for words, why, Freeman had a solution that would get them through their day happy as little clams. If children were misbehaving, conditions we might now see being called hyperactivity disorder, why they might need a lobotomy.
In all, Freeman lobotomized 19 children under the age of 18, including a 4-year-old. By 1967, Dr. Freeman had personally performed more than 2,900 lobotomies. In February, at Herrick Memorial Hospital in Berkeley, he performed his last when a patient died of a brain hemorrhage. Freeman was stripped of his hospital privileges.
On the treatment front, Fauci and the team of scientists at the NIH began frantically working on a vaccine, believing that would be the way to end the AIDS epidemic. Confident in their work, Health and Human Services Secretary Margaret Heckler declared in 1984 that an AIDS vaccine would be ready for testing within 2 years. But banking on a vaccine proved to be harder than it seemed. 2 years passed and there wasn't one even ready for testing. The public was losing patience. Pharmaceutical companies were also racing towards a treatment for AIDS, realizing the incredible potential for profits. In 1987, one such company was Burroughs Wellcome, a British drug company who showed in a test tube that their failed cancer drug, AZT, could be repurposed to treat AIDS. Limited studies were done, long-term side effects were unknown, but in record speed, in less than 4 months, the FDA approved the drug as a treatment, claiming the benefits outweigh the risks. One of the parameters of the speedy approval process was for the drug company to bring back follow-up data in 2 years. Burroughs Wellcome agreed, but of course, since the drug was already approved, they never really needed to follow up, and so they didn't. Celia Farber did incredible reporting on the approval, use, and dangers of AZT for Spin magazine in the late 80s. In her article titled Sins of Omission, she writes, quote, "The majority of those in the AIDS-afflicted and medical communities held the drug up as the first breakthrough on AIDS. For better or worse, AZT had been approved faster than any drug in FDA history, and activists considered it a victory. The price paid for the victory, however, was that almost all government drug trials from then on focused on AZT, while over 100 other promising drugs were left uninvestigated." Now, the expensive drug made Burroughs Wellcome record profits, and at the time, it was the most expensive drug ever marketed. But people were desperate. They would do anything to get their lives back. Despite numerous doctors raising concerns about the toxicity of the drug, some even saying that it was doing the very opposite of what it claimed to do, that is, it was actually shortening the lives of their patients, Fauci and other health officials disagreed. In 1989, Fauci began to promote the drug, not only for critically ill AIDS patients, but for anyone who tested positive for HIV, including those asymptomatic who showed no signs of disease. Those patients included hospital workers, pregnant women, and even children. Doctors were stunned. The data the NIH released was limited, but nonetheless, the NIH had gone all in on AZT. Despite it becoming clearer and clearer that AZT was toxic, caused liver damage, and destroyed white blood cells, the drug continued to be used for several years after, while calls from activists and doctors to study any other possible treatments went ignored. One such treatment that was ignored was Bactrim. PCP was the leading killer in AIDS patients, and many doctors were prescribing the inexpensive antibiotic as a prophylaxis to prevent AIDS victims from developing the rare pneumonia. There was evidence that the antibiotic should be used as a prophylaxis whenever the reoccurrence rate of PCP for a given condition was over 15%. The reoccurrence rate of PCP in HIV-positive patients was over 60%. Despite the science, Dr. Fauci declined to conduct a clinical trial. Doctors and advocates continued to push for its use, and finally, a couple years later, it was adopted, after thousands of patients had already died. As Fauci and the NIH focused on vaccines and AZT for the treatment of AIDS, hundreds of drugs went unstudied, many of which were demonized. In fact, the movie Dallas Buyers Club is about treatments AIDS patients desperately sought after because of the inability to access them legally. Many doctors advocated that the best way to treat patients was to focus on mitigating the severity of the ailments that would ultimately kill them rather than trying to eradicate AIDS altogether, that the virus mutates too quickly to waste all resources and time on a vaccine or other preventatives, that everything should be studied, all avenues explored, and all options should remain on the table. But unfortunately, that's not exactly how the AIDS epidemic was handled. Big Pharma got their payday in AZT. Millions of dollars allocated by Congress went to vaccine research, which never produced anything effective. And meanwhile, along the way, hundreds of drugs and treatment options went unexplored.
I think zidovudine was a drug that was never really evaluated properly, and that its efficacy has never been proved, but its toxicity certainly is important. And I think it has killed a lot of people, especially at the higher doses. I personally think that it is not worth using alone or in combination at all.
John Lauritsen had by now written his seminal articles on AZT in the New York Native and had dug out freedom of information papers pointing to the dishonest and fraudulent use of data from the AZT Phase 2 trials.
But the real horror of this study only became apparent after going through documents which were obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. And it indicated that there had been not only sloppiness of every conceivable sort, but that there had been actual cheating in a number of areas. It indicated that the study had become unblinded very quickly in the first few weeks. Although it was planned as a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, in fact, it was nothing of the kind. Both patients and doctors knew who was getting AZT and who was getting placebo.
At first, good. Oh boy, I gained weight. And I said, boy, this stuff must be working. And then about another 2 weeks later, it did start working. The headaches came, the dizziness, the noxiousness, and the whole time I had fingernails that were so black, it looked like I had nail polish on, you know. And the upset stomachs, nothing tastes right, food or anything. And the main thing of it, it'll affect you so where you couldn't listen to people because you don't want to hear them because you're hurting so bad. And it left me impudent. It destroyed my hopes for living, you know.
So there's a guy named Curtis Wright, who was the medical examiner at FDA, who was kind of the Grand Inquisitor. He was the one they had to satisfy in order to get the drug approved, but also in order to get the marketing claims.
Maybe explain to folks why those two things are very important. Why is it that if you and I went into business tomorrow to create a drug, the FDA would have to approve it for, from a safety and efficacy standpoint, but then they'd also have to basically put guardrails around what we could actually say it's for. I don't think people fully understand that dual role there.
Well, I mean, it's the strangest thing. Richard Sackler, this second generation Sackler, is probably the most intimately acquainted with or involved with OxyContin. There's a point where he talks about how the package insert in a bottle of pills is our most potent selling instrument. And it's a strange thing, right? Because I think for the average consumer, you see that the sort of dense wording on that, and it feels like the fine print. It feels like something the doctors read. You may read it as well, but it doesn't feel like a marketing document.
Right.
But if you're the drug company, it's all about the indications. It's all about the claims that you can make for what kinds of ailments this medication might alleviate, and then also in terms of the kind of competitive positioning. So in the case of OxyContin, I'll give you a very extreme example. They didn't do any tests on the addictiveness of the drug. They didn't do any tests on the abuse liability of the drug. But there was a kind of hypothesis that they had at Purdue, which was because of the Contin system, you wouldn't have the kind of peaks and troughs of a sort of wave of euphoria when a big dose of the drug hits your bloodstream, followed by a kind of diminution and withdrawal. Instead, it's this steady, regulated, continuous flow. And their hypothesis was that because of that, it wouldn't be addictive and it wouldn't be subject to abuse. And that was a competitive advantage vis-a-vis other opioid products that were out there on the market. And you have this kind of crazy stretch where they start working very closely with Curtis Wright on the approval process. Some strange stuff happens. I mean, the company sends, I don't even think this is in the book, but the company sends Curtis Wright, this is in the 1990s, this is 95. The company sends him a webcam. This is like a very early webcam where he can talk directly with folks in Stanford. Curtis Wright starts requesting that they send things not to his FDA office, but to his house. And at a certain point, a team of people from Purdue travel to Maryland and get a hotel room, and they spend 3 days with Curtis Wright, helping him write his reviews of their studies.
Let's just pause there for a second. It's almost impossible to imagine that happening, right? I'm not saying it didn't, because you've got the email proof that it happened. I'm just saying, from a matter of process, that statement is so difficult to comprehend. So how do we put that in perspective? What did other people at the FDA know at this point in time? What do we think emboldened the Sackler leadership to do that without fear of Curtis Wright turning to them and saying, "Are you freaking crazy?"
Yeah.
I mean, how does this unfold?
So it's really hard to say, and I've tried to kind of puzzle through this. And I should say, I mean, Curtis Wright wouldn't talk to me. I got him on the phone, and he very quickly hung up. He didn't want to talk to me about any of this. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the FDA, which they dragged their feet in the way that federal bureaucracies always do. So I actually sued them in federal court to compel them to turn over documents to me. And I got a New York federal judge to order them to do document production to me, thousands and thousands of pages of documents. And my first request was for all the emails of Curtis Wright. And the FDA came back and told me that all of his correspondence and emails have either been lost or destroyed.
Yeah, which again, you couldn't make that level of malfeasance up. Like, you can't, it's so ridiculous. Like, how do they even say that with a straight face?
I know.
First tonight, an upstate addiction counselor is sounding off. He's upset after the FDA approved a powerful painkiller for children as young as 11. We're talking here about OxyContin. WYFF News Force Liz Loheis with our report tonight.
It's a black plague. It's an epidemic.
A big problem that Rich Jones says is about to get even bigger.
You're going to see it get worse and worse. You're going to see headlines about overdoses.
Jones, who is an addiction counselor at Favor, says the FDA's approval of OxyContin for children is irresponsible.
And it's just lack of oversight and irresponsible prescribing practices. I mean, it's just prescription drugs are becoming too readily available.
My name is Peter Goetje. I'm a director of the Nordic Cochrane Center in Copenhagen and professor of research design and analysis at the University of Copenhagen. 2 years ago, I found out that our prescription drugs are the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. Our drugs kill around 200,000 people in America every year, and half of these people die while they do what their doctors told them. So they die because of the side effects. The other half die because of errors. And it's often the doctors that make the errors, because any drug may come with 20, 30 or 40 warnings, contraindications, precautions, and so on. No doctor in the world knows about all this. So they give patients drugs that they should not have given them, that interact dangerously with other drugs or food items or so on. And then the patients die. That's the other half. So The other thing I found out 2 years ago was that much of what the drug industry does fulfills the criteria for organized crime in US law. And they behave in many ways like the mafia does. They corrupt everyone they can corrupt. They have bought every type of person, even including ministers of health in some countries. So there is a huge amount of corruption. In my country, for example, Denmark, we are regarded as having very little corruption. But yet we have thousands of doctors on industry payroll, although we are just 20,000 doctors. So this is an effective kind of corruption. The drug industry buys the professors first, then chiefs of department, then other chief physicians and so on. They don't buy junior doctors. So when several thousands are on industry payroll, it's really, really bad. And that's why I wrote my book, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime, How Big Pharma Has Corrupted Healthcare. I hope to convince patients not to take so many drugs because so many die from the drugs they take.
This is Dr. Peter McCullough. Dr. McCullough, you're a champion. You're a voice for those who want to have medical freedom. And I could not be prouder. Oftentimes when I'm doing business here in the Capitol, I wonder where are the great Americans, the great minds. And without hesitation, I'd say you're one of the great Americans of our time. You've faced being shut down and silenced, the name calling and the other garbage during the dark days of COVID, and you stood firm. You never compromised. You stay focused on science, and I appreciate your courage. You know, as a retired Army colonel who's fought in many of the nation's wars here, you're one of the men I look to that's going to save our republic. So I'm going to hit some points on your biography in case some people don't know who you are, but I'd be surprised if they don't by now. But Dr. McCullough is one of the most published cardiologists in America. So when you have some faceless bureaucrat sitting behind a social media platform and shutting him down with no medical degree, are you kidding me? Some kid that doesn't like what Dr. McCullough says because it's not in line with the protocols preached by the CDC. He's published over 1,000 publications, and he's 660 citations in the National Library of Medicine. And if somebody of this caliber would be shut down by some social media outlet, you've got to be kidding me. I never thought I'd see the time. He's testified before the U.S. Senate, before legislators throughout the United States. Dr. McCullough has been here last year as well, and it was the most viewed discussion in the Senate last year. He's testified, across this nation here and various legislators across the nation. Dr. McCullough has dozens of peer-reviewed publications specific to COVID. He knows what he's talking about. He's trained in it. He's a leader in the field, and yet he was shut down on social media platforms. Thank God for Elon Musk, huh? It was good to see you back. He's commented extensively on the medical response of COVID-19 from a scientific perspective, real science. He's presented at last year's Medical Freedom Panel here in the Capitol, as I mentioned. And Doctor, we're honored to have you. Before I hand the floor to you, I'd like to welcome Representative Mike Jones. Great to see you. Thank you for joining us. So, Doctor, it's an honor to have you back in Pennsylvania, and the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the audience and the ability to allow medical freedom to have its time for consideration here in the great state of Pennsylvania in America. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough, as introduced. I'm a practicing internist and cardiologist in Dallas, Texas. I'm trained in epidemiology. I now have 71 peer-reviewed publications on the pandemic as an author, as a principal investigator scientifically, and 681 citations in the National Library of Medicine. To give you a reference point, about 25 character is enough to be granted full professor of medicine, that position I've held at multiple institutions. The SARS-CoV-2 pandemic from the outset has been the largest medical disaster, the largest human disaster now of all time in our country. And the stories that you're hearing represent casualties analogous to casualties in war. December 10th, 2020, the Pfizer vaccine was emergency use authorized. Prior to COVID, emergency use authorization was only for military means, only for vaccines and other products used in the military. That mechanism was never used for a product to be used publicly. Messenger RNA is an old technology. A paper by Lalani and colleagues in a British Medical Journal characterizes U.S. efforts to develop messenger RNA since 1985. The United States had poured tens of billions of dollars into this technology. Nothing had come out of it. In 2012, DARPA, the research division of the military, announced the ADEPT P3 program, which said that they will use messenger RNA technology to end pandemics in 60 days, pandemics that our military would face. So it has been a U.S. government aspiration to use messenger RNA technology for a very long time. This technology was ready to go on the shelf. Operation Warp Speed just quickly brought it into testing. 3 days into the U.S. National Declaration of an Emergency, Stéphane Bancel from Moderna announced that they had a vaccine. 3 days into the emergency. And what we learned is Moderna had co-written its patent with the U.S. National Institutes of Health years ahead of time. So there was great planning for the possibility of a SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. In the last 90 days, the U.S. Congress Select Committee for the Origins of the Coronavirus has revealed that the origin of the virus was the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, China. And it was work done by U.S. researchers led at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Ralph Barrick as the senior author, who in 2015 had published papers describing the creation of a chimeric virus, an intentionally human-engineered virus. And those papers were published in Nature Communications and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. In the House investigation, we learned that former NIAID Director Anthony Fauci and NIH Director Francis Collins in January of 2020 held a teleconference with leaders in virology worldwide to create a deception campaign to lead the academic and public communities to believe that the virus arose out of nature. The official U.S. government narrative for 3 years was that the virus spontaneously rose out of nature in Wuhan, China. And in the last 90 days, through investigation led by the committee led by Representative Comer, assisted by Representative Chip Roy and others, I've had personal communication with Chip Roy on this. Our government agencies have all done an about-face, including the CDC via former Director Redfield, the National Security Administration, the FBI, the Department of Energy. They have all capitulated and have stated that indeed the virus came out of the lab in Wuhan, China, and to make matters worse, those agencies had oversight over what was going on. And in a 419-0 vote, our U.S. House of Representatives voted to declassify all the documents on the creation of the virus, the U.S. creation of the virus outsourced to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Vaccine development was going on in concert with the creation of this. It was done in a biosecurity level 4 lab in Wuhan, China. The vaccines were designed and held initially by Moderna. Pfizer had a very similar version after Moderna. Moderna is suing Pfizer for copying their code as we sit here today. Later on, Janssen came forward, AstraZeneca, Oxford vaccine in the UK, and then Novavax from the United States. In total, there's 12 vaccines that have been used on the market. Where we are today is that the original Pfizer Moderna vaccines, which are monovalent vaccines, have been withdrawn from the market. They never were fully licensed by the US FDA. They were never commercial products. They never had full package inserts. Janssen has been removed from the market. The original Novavax and now the bivalent Moderna and Pfizer vaccines exist on the market today. We have a situation where there has been unprecedented injuries, disabilities, and deaths with these vaccines. Now, our CDC says that 92% of Americans have taken at least one shot. We learned from a study from Harvard and Northeastern University called the COVID Community States Program, using a very large representative survey, that the CDC was overestimating. In fact, the true number of Americans who took at least one shot is 75%. That means we have 25% of the population that's available to study as unvaccinated, and our experts testifying after me will talk about the differences between vaccinated and unvaccinated. As a doctor, I am seeing and managing patients who suffer vaccine injuries, disabilities, and sadly dealing with families whose loved ones died after the vaccine. What I can tell you is that by January 22nd of 2021, the U.S. Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System had already recorded 182 deaths with the COVID-19 vaccine. That's just actually a few weeks into the campaign. The whole system, for all the vaccines combined, for every year it's ever been done, typically comes in at about 150 deaths, which can happen. People can die of acute allergic reactions, widely administered vaccines. But 182, we were over the line. The program was co-administered, and it still is today, not by a separate vaccine administration committee or organization, but is co-administered by the FDA and the CDC. Neither of those two agencies have any historical experience in administering a big vaccine campaign. Neither should they. The FDA is supposed to be a separate watchdog on drug safety. The CDC is strictly to do outbreak investigation, data analytics, and in vitro diagnostics. None of them have a role in directly administering a vaccine program. So by conflict of interest, neither one of those organizations was ever going to stop this campaign for safety. This campaign should have had an independent data safety monitoring board of experts to be reviewing data on a monthly basis. And when they saw a signal, as one was seen in January 22nd of 2021, the program should have been immediately paused to figure out why were people dying after the vaccine. Pfizer, Moderna, and the other manufacturers, by obligation, kept records for 90 days after release of their vaccine. By obligation, by regulatory obligation. None of them voluntarily disclosed their data to the U.S. public. They did to the FDA. And under court order, after many, many months, Pfizer was forced to release their data that the FDA knew about. In fact, the lawyer for the FDA wanted to block this information for 55 years to the American public. This is prima facie evidence that the FDA is involved in a drug safety cover-up. What we learned from that dossier is that Pfizer knew about 1,223 deaths within 90 days of their vaccine, sometimes many patients on the same day they took it or a few days afterwards. It exactly matched the early data in VAERS. And Pfizer intentionally kept this confidential. The FDA kept it confidential. To this day, not a single Pfizer representative has been questioned by any congressional or Senate committee on this. Moderna still has not released their data. The president of Moderna has been before the U.S. Senate. He was never asked about the 90-day regulatory dossier of what the vaccine manufacturers know. Now we have 3,400 and growing papers in the peer-reviewed literature on vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths. 3,400 papers. This is astonishing. From case reports to case series, pathophysiologic studies, conclusive studies showing the vaccine is the cause of these injuries. And they fall into four broad categories. The first one is cardiovascular. The vaccines cause heart damage. It's called myocarditis. I see this routinely in my practice every day. The U.S. FDA and regulatory agencies agree the vaccines cause myocarditis. That's heart inflammation. The genetic vaccines install the code for the lethal Wuhan spike protein, and the spike protein damages the heart. As more and more blood flows through the heart, more vaccine is deposited. In cardiology, we have guidance and clear practice patterns and community standard of care patterns that say before COVID and before the vaccines, if a person has myocarditis, they cannot participate in sports because a surge of adrenaline, a surge of stress hormones can precipitate a cardiac arrest. So in my practice, I have never let a person with myocarditis, whether they feel it or not, ever participate in sports. Now, before the vaccines, the US NCAA, Big Ten League, the US military, the Israeli military, they had screening programs for myocarditis because there was a concern that COVID could cause myocarditis. And they found a handful of cases that probably met a definition. They were clinically inconsequential, no hospitalizations, and no deaths. They all gave up screening for myocarditis. Then we bring in the vaccines, which the regulatory agencies agree cause myocarditis, and none of those organizations resumed screening for myocarditis. And so we've seen unprecedented deaths of athletes. In the European sports leagues, I've published with Dr. Polykritis from Italy that in a stable period before COVID-19, the rate of cardiac arrests under age 35, pro and semi-pro, that's a lot of people in these leagues, 29 cardiac arrests per year. Before COVID, now since the vaccines, that number annualized is 283. Sudden cardiac deaths. We see montage reel after montage reel of sudden cardiac death. I can tell you as a cardiologist, there are two periods of time where the body has a surge of adrenaline. It's during sports, and it's also about 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. do the normal waking cycles. And those are the two patterns where we see death of unknown cause. Now we see report after report on a daily basis of death of unknown cause. It's my conclusion as a cardiologist that it is the vaccine until proven otherwise. With myocarditis now, we have autopsy-proven conclusive papers published by Pharma, Washington University in St. Louis, by Gill, Connecticut, University of Michigan and Minnesota, by Choi in Korea, of fatal vaccine-induced myocarditis in young people. Conclusive autopsy proven. It is unequivocal that the vaccines cause a form of cardiac death due to myocarditis. For that reason, one death should have caused all of these to be pulled off the market. Recently, the FDA pulled an eye drop off the market because of an unusual side effect that caused death. One case. And so this has gone on because there is no data safety monitoring board. The FDA is actually administering the program. They're not providing any safety protections for Americans. And in this cardiovascular category also includes acceleration of atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and need for bypass surgery and angioplasty, includes stroke, both hemorrhagic and ischemic stroke. These are all described in the peer-reviewed literature. The second major category is neurologic. And you've heard reports today from two patients who suffered neurologic damage from the vaccine. Their neurologic damage, in addition to stroke, can include syndromes such as Guillain-Barré syndrome, ascending paralysis, of which has been described with all the vaccines, forms of neuropsychiatric conditions, including acute psychosis requiring hospitalization, progression of Parkinson's and other neurologically debilitating diseases, well described in the literature. And then a broad group developing small fiber neuropathy. And you've heard about that, numbness and tingling in the hands and feet that's relentless. Seizures have been reported, new onset seizures reported in the peer-reviewed literature, people requiring epilepsy. Blindness from multiple mechanisms, hearing loss. There are untold numbers of senior citizens who took these vaccines who now have these progressive problems to deal with. The third category is blood clots. The vaccines unequivocally cause blood clots through the mechanism of producing the Wuhan spike protein. The spike protein, which is now in the bodies of everyone who've taken these vaccines, promotes blood clots, large blood clots. A paper from the FDA by Wu and colleagues from the US FDA published in the peer-reviewed literature described thousands of blood clots that they had in a sample going from the ankle to the hip, the largest blood clots we've ever seen, shooting to the lungs. 11% of cases in the Wu paper were fatal. My experience with these blood clots are they're enormously resistant to blood thinners. We're using all different types of blood thinners, adding additional drugs, and they are not going away like characteristic blood clots. Studies show the Wuhan spike protein is inside the blood clots and it's folding, forming what's called amyloid structures. Amyloid structures are like rubber in the human body. They look like rubber, and the blood clots are large and rubberized, and they are not being dissolved. A very disturbing paper recently published by Lee and colleagues with a sample of millions and millions of patients from 2021. They had unvaccinated and vaccinated. They did careful retinal scans. This is astonishing. They found astronomical rates of blood clots in the retinal arteries and retinal veins in those vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated. And that was only with 2 shots back in 2021. 2 years later, these still exist. They're still there. The risk is there. So what I'm telling you is these vaccines have a very long effect in the human body. And when we see blood clots in the arteries, small arteries and veins of the eyes, they're reflecting what's going on in the body. The blood clots are coming from elsewhere. And so they certainly can be a cause of blindness, but it is a general reflection of blood clotting occurring through the body throughout. This is a very large study, and it's the longest study showing that there is a tail, at least a 2-year tail of risk and concern of anyone who's taken one of these vaccines back in 2021. Fourth category and final category are immune syndromes. There are now immune syndromes that occur after the vaccines that are well accepted in the literature. In fact, they have acronyms. One's called vaccine-induced thrombocytopenic purpura, VITT. It's a blood disorder where there's clotting and bleeding. It requires hospitalization. It's a medical disaster, and roughly a third die in the hospital of this horrible death. Another syndrome is called multi-system inflammatory disorder. Typically occurs in younger people. We have Americans who have had this syndrome where their organs have all been damaged. They end up with tracheostomy tubes in wheelchairs. They are wrecked. A recent report from Japan describes a 14-year-old girl who took a first shot of messenger RNA and had some side effects. A second shot had more side effects. And then 6 months later, she takes the booster. Her sister describes her having trouble breathing that night, and the parents find her dead the next day. They do an autopsy. Every single organ in the body is being rotted out with inflammation in her body, multi-system inflammatory disorder, which is fatal. One case of an adolescent dying of such a syndrome should globally pull these off the market. Autopsy-proven, meticulous cases. So to summarize, there are 4 domains of injury: cardiovascular, neurologic, thrombotic, and immunologic. The hardest question I've faced so far in all of my appearances in the media, and I've probably given more media appearances now than any public figure in the world on COVID-19. The question came from Joe Rogan on his podcast in 2021. He said, Dr. McCullough, if these vaccines are so bad, why doesn't everybody have a side effect and are damaged after the vaccines? I didn't have the answer at that time, but I have it now. A paper by Schmeling and colleagues from Denmark has clearly shown that the batches of vaccines that come out, the lots groupings, are not the same. They had all the Pfizer data administered in Denmark, and they had every side effect. They found 3 risk groups of batches. The first batch, which was about a third of people who got the vaccine, 0 side effects, nothing whatsoever. It's like taking a shot of saline, nothing. The second group, which is about 2/3, had some moderate side effects, but the rate of serious side effects was pretty low. Then there's a third group, which is 4.2% of everybody of the vials, their side effect rate was through the roof. When they did what's called an R-squared analysis, that is how much of the variation in side effects is explained by this batch-to-batch variability, the answer was 75% plus. That means we have a product manufacturing problem. Either the vials, these vials, and unfortunately, these 2 ladies almost certainly received a bad batch. And these vials either have hyperconcentrated lipid nanoparticles and excessive amounts of messenger RNA. And in the United States, 94% of people who took a shot took messenger RNA, so we can stay on that technology. The other possibilities is that it could be contaminated with what's called cDNA or plasmids or other contaminants. It's certainly possible. I think hyperconcentration of messenger RNA is most likely because what we're seeing are messenger RNA spike protein mediated injuries. But Senator Ron Johnson, just from the VAERS data, had sent analysis to the CDC on this and the FDA, asking for them to analyze the lot-to-lot variations that we're seeing, and he received a multi-page letter back that essentially says, we disagree, we don't see any difference in lot-to-lot. Now it's in the peer-reviewed publication forever in medical history showing it is a batch variability problem. Fortunately, most Americans received batch 1 or batch 2. They're okay. Fortunately, they're fine. But for the small number of people who did receive a batch, we have big problems. A Zogby survey done last summer, a population-based sample, suggests 15% of Americans now have some injury, disability, or some medical problem they're dealing with due to COVID-19 vaccines. Is roughly that number. And our CDC vSafe data, which was the self-reported data from the cell phone, show that 7.7% of people who take a shot have to go to the emergency room or urgent care with some acute problem after the vaccine. So the CDC vSafe, the Zogby survey, the VAERS data, they're all cohesive, and the data are cohesive worldwide. We see this in every reporting system: Yellow Card, VigiSafe, and the UTRIS system. So it's seen everywhere. In 2021, I started to raise my concerns regarding the vaccines in March of 2021 in the Texas Senate. I published a paper in May of 2021 with 57 authors. We sent it to every government agency saying we have serious questions regarding safety. In June of 2022, the World Council for Health, which is a large representative body of investigators and those who are working in COVID-19, issued a recall for the vaccines. Take them all off the market. And then on December 7th, 2022, I called in a special Senate panel in conclusion that we should withdraw all the vaccines from the market for unacceptable safety and harm to Americans. There has been no response from our regulatory agencies in terms of pulling these off the market. There still has been no change in the stance of our regulatory agencies. They continue to support these vaccines with essentially illegal and unlawful promotion of the vaccines. None of them are fully licensed. They can't be advertised on TV. We can't have HHS, the FDA, or the CDC, or the vaccine companies advertising vaccines on TV or on the radio. And we certainly can't have any organization mandating vaccines that are experimental, emergency use authorized, and have generated this terrible safety track record and trail of injuries, disabilities, and deaths in the United States. That's my testimony. Thank you for having me.